Hello and welcome to the second episode of the College Football Fanatics podcast. I am your host, Dan, back at it again. Um, what just last weekend was week 4 for college football, and this season is starting to turn out sort of like what 2007 college football season turned out, where I think it was somewhere like 5 or 6 weeks in a row the number 2 team changed dramatically. Teams that the number 2 team just seemed to be a curse when you were there. I mean, that was the same season that Michigan played Appalachian State, ranked number 2, I believe, actually, and lost that game in a dramatic fashion. Um, I don't think I actually went to that game, but it was still an insane game. To if anybody watches a replay of that game, it's one of the craziest games I think I've ever seen, because Michigan was just projected to dominate that game. And this season is starting to turn out somewhat like that, where teams that were projected to be good are not ending up to be very good, and teams that were not projected to do very well, like Kansas, have been overachieving out of their mind. The USC just played Oregon State, and they won an ugly game. They just scraped by with the win, and it was hard to tell that they were a top 10 team. They did not look good. They had a lot of major issues that they just couldn't really get the ball moving all that well, and Oregon State was just stopping them on quite a few drives, but everything just seemed to go wrong. But I actually want to talk about a game that occurred a few weeks ago, which was Georgia versus Oregon. Georgia versus Oregon was a really great game, and I think that was week 1 or 2, and I can't remember which one it was. But it was a great game because you really got to see Georgia playing a quality opponent, who had who has a very good quarterback starting for them, and has a good offensive line, a good defensive line. And you got to watch Georgia pretty much slice through them. Bo Nix, who's the quarterback for Georgia, threw 2 interceptions that game. And he really seemed to threw 2 interceptions, sorry, not in that game, in the first half alone. And he really seemed to struggle against Georgia a lot. And I think that speaks to just how good Georgia actually is. Now, granted, Oregon doesn't have Kayvon Thibodeau anymore, and Kayvon Thibodeau was arguably the best or second best defensive end in last year's draft class. He was up there with Aiden Hutchinson, and is quite likely is going to be a star in the NFL in the next few seasons, and I have no doubt that he'll do very well there. But they lost him, and from what I could tell, they didn't come up with a strategy to replace the production that he had. They weren't really rushing more guys on their defensive line, and they weren't trying to make it up. They were just trying to replace him on a 1-and-1 basis. And just like Michigan couldn't do that with Aiden Hutchinson and David Ajabo, you can't do that with a player as good as Kayvon Thibodeau. I mean, he's just too good to rely on, your former backup defensive end to play with, or to play at that same level. The tight end room for Georgia looked phenomenal. Before I rewatched this game. I was under the impression that Michigan had the best tight end room in college football. And to some degree, I still think that, but I also can understand an argument for saying that Georgia has the best tight end room in college football. And that is and they're two starters that seem to switch off a lot. Brock Bowers being one of them looked phenomenal. I mean, they just looked completely unstoppable. Michigan's tight end room with Luke Schoonmaker and Eric All looks good, but there's something that's just different about Georgia and their tight ends when they play to what Michigan and their tight ends look like. There is just different, and it's not necessarily something that you can entirely put a finger on. It's just something that when it passes the eye test, that it just looks better when Georgia's doing it. And like I said last week, Georgia is still the team to beat in college football. I'm not saying that the Nick Saban era of winning national championships is over, but he has competition now. For the past, 10 years, it seems like Nick Saban has dominated college football with Alabama. He has recruited at the highest of levels. I saw a stat that this year that really proves the point of this year. 35% of all 5-star recruits go to one of 3 schools, and that's Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State. And when you recruit at the level of 35% of the best players in the country are going to 3 schools, it's going to be hard to compete. But Kirby Smart has brought Georgia from a win check for Alabama to now this is a serious game that has to be played, and mistakes will cost you dearly. You saw that last year when Alabama won the championship, the SEC championship, and Georgia won the national championship. Mistakes were paid for in each game, and it affected the outcome like rarely I have seen before. Now, another thing that I want to talk about with Georgia is that Georgia's defensive line was getting to the quarterbacks that they've played again quite easily. I mean, it just looks like they're in a toll booth and just waiting for permission to go by. I mean, they are just they're stopping for a couple of seconds, being held up from the offensive line, and then they're just getting by and pressuring that quarterback into making hurried up throws, or into having to scramble out of the pocket, or into completely struggling against their entire offensive line, which brings me to my next point, which makes their secondary look even better, considering that their secondary seems to be quite sticky on the receivers. they usually are not they're usually within a couple of feet of the receivers, and there really aren't any open players being hit down the field too often. It's usually just you're picking up, a few yards. Georgia or Oregon had a lot of success in the screen plays. Um, they had a lot of success with the with some crossing routes thrown over the middle. They really did not have success with throwing the ball, 40 yards down the field. I mean, Bo Nix, his first interception, he threw the ball 40 yards down the field, and um, Georgia's I think he's a safety, Stark. I think he's a freshman as well. Had a phenomenal interception, and you can't. The throw wasn't bad. It was just Georgia's defense. Georgia's secondary players are just that good to play. So getting away from the Georgia Oregon game that was played a few weeks ago, I want to talk about the Big Ten a little bit. Michigan State did not have a good game. Not at all. In fact, they really, really sucked. They played a not so great. They played a not so great Minnesota team that shouldn't have beat them nearly as bad as they did. They Michigan State's only points came in the last couple of minutes of the game, when Minnesota could have pretty clearly scored another touchdown. And this is a year that Michigan State does not have Kenneth Walker anymore. And I think that that's really affecting how Mel Tucker is able to win games. I mean, when you look at Kenneth Walker last year, he had over 1,000 yards rushing. Even on the Michigan game, he had like 200 yards rushing alone, and he really led them to the win against Michigan. And he led their team. He was quite important to the way that they won games. Now, in I think 4 years, Michigan State, I think, has only had one winning season, and that was last season, I believe. So I think that Mel Tucker's job is going to start being on the line pretty soon. I mean, I'd preferably like to wait for like the mid-season break, so like week 8, for like the middle of the season, to see truly how bad it is. Because if he's just lost this game, but he goes on to win, and he goes on to win almost every other game, then I spoke too soon, and Mel Tucker's job is not on the line, and he's not going to be fired anytime soon. But if he ends up losing against Maryland, if he ends up losing against Wisconsin, which Wisconsin is not Wisconsin does not have the team that they have had in the past this season. They are not nearly as good on defense or on offense. They're not going to be able to outscore really an opponent all that easily. Michigan State should win that game. But with this Minnesota loss, it's now looking more and more likely that that's going to be a dogfight and that they're going to lose against Maryland, Michigan, and against Ohio State. And that is looking to be maybe not the end of Mel Tucker's career, but that would probably be the end of his time at Michigan State. Now I want to get on to Michigan, Maryland. This was not a good. This was Michigan's first test against a team that was that had a against a team that I think was ranked under 125. Michigan has not played anybody with any real team. I mean, they played Colorado State, Hawaii, UConn in their preseason or in their non-conference games, I should say. Colorado State and Hawaii are ranked in the top 5 of the worst teams in college football by CBS Sports. Hawaii is number 1, and I think Colorado State is number 4. They have a ranking system of the bottom 25 instead of the top 25. And those were Hawaii and Colorado State's rankings. UConn wasn't on that list, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were not too far behind. They did not look very good in the game at Michigan, and I've caught snippets of their games against other opponents, and I can't say that they look much better against them either. So Maryland was the first time Michigan really seemed to play an opponent that was of any quality. Now, in years prior, you look at the schedule every year, and you have a few almost guaranteed wins. Rutgers was usually on there. Indiana was on there quite often, although Indiana would surprise a lot. They had games where Michigan would win, but it wouldn't be by 4 or 5 touchdowns. It would be like it was by a field goal or a point even at times. So Maryland wasn't always an automatic win, but sometimes they were. Illinois is on there quite often lately. And Maryland used to be on there. Maryland is no longer an automatic win against Michigan, or I think even against any other team. Maryland and Rutgers pretty much were like the bottom of the Big Ten for the past 6-7 years. And things are starting to change now. They are starting to look like a true Big Ten contender team. They're looking better than they are trending up in their quality of team. And it's really interesting to see this play out where people are like, oh, that's an easy win. Well, if we look at the game that just happened between Michigan and Maryland, it's not an easy win anymore. Now, how much of that is Michigan falling from last year, and how much of it is Maryland getting better? I'm not able to say with 100% certainty, but there is a strong Maryland is a strong team this year, and I wouldn't be surprised if they held Ohio State to within probably 2 touchdowns. I would not be surprised at all. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if they ended up going on this season 10-2. I think that they are truly a team that could end up doing that and really pose a problem for Michigan in the future. And that is really that could end up being really interesting to see how Maryland goes from considered the bottom of the Big Ten to one of the premier teams in the Big Ten, and see how that affects their recruiting. So last year, Maryland recruited in the mid 30s. I think their rank was like 33 or something like that. Um, the year prior to that, they were in the 40s. So I think they were ranked. I actually think they were ranked 40 for recruiting, according to 24/7 Sports. Um, I think they were similar the year before that, and then I think they were ranked in the 50s or the 60s 4 years ago. And that tends and this trending up of getting better and better prospects um, when the top 20 is filled with like 10 SEC teams, you start to see that after about the top 10, the next 20 recruiting teams are pretty spread out around college football. You see them in the Pac-12, you see them in the Big 12, and so Maryland has been working their way up, and it's really starting to show on the field now. So let's talk about. I came across about this article. I came across this ESPN article. I came across this ESPN article the other day. It was posted 3 days ago, and its title is "Breaking Down Potential Flaws for 16 College Football Playoff Contenders." Now, I'm not going to talk about all 16 teams. It's written by Bill Connolly, who I think is a fairly knowledgeable writer for ESPN. So it starts off with talking about Georgia and their game against Kent State. Talks about a 75-yard touchdown to their tight end, which was a quick strike touchdown. And then it goes on to Alabama. It doesn't actually really talk all that much about Georgia's flaws, but it does once you get out of the number one spot, because Georgia is obviously ranked number one in the AP poll. And I also believe they're ranked number one in the coaches poll as well. So it talks about Alabama next. I'm not going to recite this article for you word for word. You can go read it on ESPN's website. Alabama is currently ranked second. They're 4-0, obviously. They just demolished Vanderbilt, which not a great team to like scream that you just demolished. I mean, if you're a top 25 team, you're expected to crush Vanderbilt. That's pretty much a given. They're the bottom of the SEC. It says their current odds for making the playoff is 84%. I agree with that. I think that the current top four teams are probably the top four teams that are going to make it into the college football playoff this season. I don't think we're going to see a situation like last season where you're going to see a group of 5 team make it in. I just don't think that there are any group of 5 teams that have played well enough to warrant getting into the playoff. Not that there are a group of 5 teams that aren't playing well. There are, just not well enough to make the college football playoff. I mean, Kansas is playing great right now. I think they're 4-0 now. And Kentucky is also playing great. I think they're 3-1. They're just not playing to the level that Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State are playing. And I would love to add Michigan into that grouping of teams that are playing phenomenally, but I can't look at them through maize and blue colored glasses. I have to look at them realistically, and they are just not playing to a playoff contender level at the moment. The biggest issue for Alabama, their fatal flaw, according to Bill Connolly, is Bryce Young, as phenomenal of a quarterback as he is. And I talked about him last week, and I kind of gushed over him because he just looks really, really good. As phenomenal of a quarterback he is, he doesn't have enough help in the on the outside. And what that means is his receivers are not creating space enough to help him outplay the better teams. So you really saw this when Alabama and Texas played. Alabama could get very little separation from the cornerbacks and the safeties, and it was a mess for Alabama. They ended up with a win by 1 point, but it was a mess of a game for them. And Texas played phenomenally. And I truly believe that if Quinn Ewers had stayed in that game and not gotten injured, we would be having a very different conversation about Alabama and a very different conversation about Texas. Texas, I think, would have won that game by 3 touchdowns. And we would be saying, how has Alabama fallen so far? And not, and we wouldn't be looking at Alabama as even a contender for the playoff. The next team that's covered is Ohio State. And unfortunately, I do have to cover them, even though they are the most bitter rival of my favorite team, which is Michigan. They annihilated Wisconsin 52-21. Currently ranked 3rd in the AP poll. The game was over by halftime. Wisconsin did not have any chance of winning this game at the end of the halftime. It was just too far. They were just too far ahead. Ohio State was just too far ahead, and Wisconsin just doesn't have the talent to go up against a team against that Ohio State team and win. Ohio State's chances of making the odds 77.5. And their biggest flaw, the defense gets burned in the red zone. And the defense gets burned, and in the red zone they struggle. Which, when you want to stop, when you're in a game where you want to stop the other team from scoring, is not a good thing, obviously. Next team, Georgia. They're obviously ranked number 1 in the AP poll. They just beat Kent State in a not entirely convincing fashion, but still looked pretty good. Chances of making the college football playoff, 72.7%. Their fatal flaw is they have a passive pass defense. They rank 81st in passing success rate allowed, which, for a team that I have looked at and thought that they looked phenomenal, is not very good. And if they want to end up making the college football playoff, they're going to have to get that under control. Now, it's only week 4 or week 5 now. There's still a bunch of weeks left in the game. I mean, we're only a little under a third of the way through the season. And it really teams change quite often in this sport over the course of a season. If you would have asked anybody a year ago, or over a year ago now, but if you would have asked anybody at the beginning of last season, Michigan had a 2% chance of making the college football, or making the Big Ten championship game, and a 0.2% chance of making the college football playoff, and they made both. So teams change teams can change quite dramatically over the course of a season. I think if Georgia stays healthy, they'll get in. So on to the next team. Now, this is where I start to disagree a little bit with my buddy Bill over here. I don't actually know him. I'm just trying to, I don't know. But I disagree with Bill, because he says that Clemson has a better chance of making the college football playoff than Michigan does. And I don't think that that's accurate. He says that Clemson's chance is 43.4%. They are currently undefeated, 4-0. They played Wake Forest and won 51-45. And they're currently ranked 5th in the AP. Clemson, I've watched some of Clemson's games, and I don't see anything to suggest that they are a playoff contending team. Their offense is good, is decent, but they have like zero defense, which is what Bill says their fatal flaw is. He goes defense with 3 question marks after it. And is really bad. They allowed Wake Forest to score 45 points on them. This became a shootout and not a blowout, which, yes, Wake Forest is not a bad team, and they were ranked number 21, but again, it's still Wake Forest. At the at the level that Clemson is recruiting, they should not be coming close to losing to Wake Forest. I mean, this is under a touchdown. This is if Wake Forest scores a touchdown, Clemson loses this game. So I want to that now move on to Michigan is the next team that Bill brings up. And he says that their chances are 30.3%, which, with the exception of last year, this is Michigan's highest ranking since I think the 2016 the 2016 season, where Michigan was ranked number 2 going into Iowa, and they lost by a point. So I actually want to talk about that, and I'll talk about that after I talk about Michigan's fatal flaw, according to Bill, and that is finishing drives. Staying on the field seems to be keeping their offense on the field seems to be a problem for Michigan this year. And it was also a problem for quite a bit of last year as well. Michigan had a problem when they would get into 20 yards into the red zone, and they just would come up either short on plays or something like that. Michigan got a lot of their points last year by being a very explosive team and not being a nickel and dime team where you get 5-10 yards every play. They were a team, they were like number 1 in plays over 30 yards, in plays over 30 yards. And a lot of what contributed to that was the versatility of Michigan last year. And while I think Michigan is more versatile, I don't think Michigan is as deep in their games as they were last year. Last year, we had 2 major starters with Blake Corum and Hassan Haskins, and we had Donovan Edwards to back up for those 2 players. This year, Donovan Edwards replaces Hassan Haskins, and last game, Donovan Edwards was not in the game because he was injured. And that allowed for little relief for Blake Corum. He would run plays. He would get exhausted because he just ran 30 yards. And college and football is a very tiring game. And he would come out, and at one point they put in CJ Stokes, and CJ Stokes put the ball on the ground, and Maryland, I believe, got the recovery. So that's a big issue. So finishing drives within like 20 yards of the end zone is a huge issue, because if you can't score a touchdown there, you're not going to be able to run all over teams like Ohio State and Georgia and Alabama. I mean, they're just too good for you to get 30 yards every single time. So people think that the most important plays are, what happens on third down. It's not the most important plays. The most important plays are what happens when you're within 20 yards of the end zone. Because that really tells the difference between a good team and a great team. So let's move on. I said earlier that I wanted to talk about Iowa and Michigan. So I was at the 2016 game. That is a very memorable game because I went with my family that year, and I went with my aunt, who was a graduate of the University of Iowa. And Iowa was not ranked, and there was no indication to believe that Iowa would give Michigan um, any struggle. And I was acting like an idiot. And I was telling my aunt that Michigan was going to blow out Iowa. Um, and what ended up happening was I ended up screaming my head off at the Michigan offense, because they were not doing what I had wanted them to do and run all over Iowa so that I could prove my aunt right, or so that I could prove myself right to my aunt. And in the final few seconds of the game, Iowa kicks a field goal and wins the game 20-19. Now, this would have been, this would have been okay if if I hadn't acted like an idiot, telling my aunt um, how good Michigan was, and how they were going to beat Iowa, because she never let me forget it, and still to this day does not let me forget it. Every time Michigan and Iowa plays, she always brings that story up, and I'm always very embarrassed about that story. Um, Michigan is going to Iowa again this season. Michigan is obviously, like I said earlier, is ranked number 4th in the AP poll. Iowa Stadium, I can't remember the name of it for the life of me, is where top 5 teams go to die, according to just about everybody. um, in Iowa has played. Iowa has in the past, I think 5 years, has played 6 top 5 teams at home, and has won 5 of those games, uh, which which is going to be a problem for Michigan, who is looking like they are struggling against Maryland. Now, in Iowa's first game, they had more. Iowa had more touchdowns, or had more wins than touchdowns at the end of their first game, which is a crazy thing to think about. Because usually when a team wins a game, they have at least one touchdown. Well, no, that's not how Iowa wants to work this season, and that's not how they have been working out. Iowa always has a good defense. Um, it's just the way that they structure their defense. It's the way that they bring players back to cover receivers when needed, and the way that they can get to the quarterback. And that's going to prove to be a very big test for Michigan's offense. The offensive line looks good. They've been giving JJ McCarthy a lot of time. But I still worry about his youth, although he had shown times in the Maryland game where I was proven wrong. At one point he took a sack, a sack in the Maryland game when nobody was open. And I actually applaud him for that, because I would have. Now, I wish he would have thrown the ball out, but instead of taking that sack, but I would rather him take a 1-yard sack, which I think is what it ended up being. It was like 1 or 2 yards. It wasn't a huge loss of plays, but he ended up taking a 1 or 2 yard sack, and he didn't try to throw the ball to a receiver that was not open. You see a lot of times with young quarterbacks who are big playmakers, they want to throw the ball and have that headline play, that ESPN top 10 plays of the week play. But when guys try to be a superhero and throw phenomenal throws and it ends up badly, more often than not, it's going to end up being an interception or a fumble or something like that, or just something that you don't want happening. And that's a big thing that I saw with JJ McCarthy, was that he didn't try to do that. Now, I'm going to talk about a few more teams from this article here. So USC still undefeated. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, they had an ugly game against Oregon State, only winning by 3 points, 17-14. They are currently ranked in sixth and projected, and their odds of making the college football playoff is 26.6. I think that's too high. I think Tennessee actually has a better chance of making the college football playoff than USC does. Their fatal flaw is over reliance on turnovers. And they're currently plus 15 in turnover margin, which is unbelievable, actually. Like that is a really phenomenal turnover margin. It almost reminds me of Iowa last year, who Iowa always has a lot of turnovers, but Iowa last year, thanks to a phenomenal turnover margin, their defense led their team to a 6-0 start. My mistake. The plus 15 turnover margin isn't actually USC. That's actually Iowa's turnover margin last year. So while I think that the USC team is better than Iowa was last year on offense, there are a lot of similarities, and I would argue that for USC to continue to be undefeated, they would have to continue to turn over the ball. But once they start playing better teams later this season, that turnover margin I expect to go down quite a lot. So USC since week 1 has 11 interceptions and 7 fumbles. So that's 18 turnovers, which is even stronger than what Iowa was looking at last year. The next team I'm going to talk about, they have Minnesota, Penn State, and Utah with the next highest playoff odds. But there is nothing that I really want to discuss with any of those teams. Tennessee is the next team that I'd like to discuss. They're ranked currently 9th, and they just won a game against Florida, 38-33. Tennessee is looking to be a very good very good team. Their offense is reacting well to most of the defenses that they've been up against. Their fatal flaw, pass defense, and this is very true. Florida was able to pass the ball pretty easily against um, against Tennessee. For them to get better, or for Tennessee to truly make the playoff, their pass defense, their secondary is going to have to play a lot better and be a lot tighter on the receivers. Their current odds of reaching the college football playoff is 6.6%. So that's all that I'm going to be talking about today. Um, Next week, I will be talking about mostly about games that were played this week. I'm gonna focus slightly less on Michigan. I'm probably gonna watch the Ohio State game and react to that next week. And I'll watch Alabama as well and react and have reactions um, for those two games that are coming up this week, or I should say this weekend. Um, and that's all. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out the next podcasts that are going to be on here. And thanks for paying attention and listening to the College Football Fanatics podcast. I am your host, Dan, and have a great day.